It began like so many ordinary weekends. A father of two, known in his small town as dependable, steady, the type of man who didn't disappear without explanation, told his family he was heading up to the hunting lodge for a couple of days. It was late autumn, the kind of season when the air grew sharp and the woods fell silent, and he wanted a short retreat before winter set in. He promised his wife he would only be gone until Monday morning, back in time to drop the kids off at school and return to work. It was meant to be uneventful, just a quiet few days in a place he knew well. The drive out there was one he had taken countless times. He kept the same routine, packing his truck with just the essentials, a few groceries, his gear, and his rifle. Friends later said nothing seemed unusual. He was in good spirits, looking forward to some time alone. His family watched him leave, not realizing it would be the last time they would ever see him alive. On the first evening, he phoned his wife. It was short, casual, the kind of call that didn't suggest anything was wrong. He mentioned the weather, said the lodge felt colder than usual, but reassured her everything was fine. She told him to be careful, as she always did. He promised he'd be back Monday. That was the last time anyone heard his voice. Monday morning came, and the children were ready for school. His wife expected to hear his truck pull into the driveway, but the hours slipped by without a sign. At first, she assumed he was delayed, maybe cleaning up at the lodge before heading home. But by noon, worry began to settle in. By evening, panic was undeniable. She called his cell phone over and over. No answer. Friends drove by his workplace. He hadn't shown up. That night, she called the sheriff's office to report him missing. Deputies were dispatched to the hunting lodge the next morning. The building sat deep in the woods, a long gravel road leading up to it. When they arrived, his truck was there, parked just as if he had only stepped inside. The doors were locked, the keys still in his jacket pocket hanging by the door. Inside, the scene looked almost too normal. His wallet was on the table. A small duffel bag had been unpacked. Groceries were stacked neatly on the counter, some half-used, suggesting he had made meals. The bed was unmade, showing he had slept there at least one night. Nothing appeared to be missing except for him. The most curious detail was the fireplace. It was still warm, ashes glowing faintly as if a fire had burned through the night before. Investigators crouched down, taking note of the heavy scent of smoke still clinging to the room. Nothing about the scene looked violent. No broken furniture, no blood, no sign of a struggle. It was as if the man had simply vanished into thin air. Deputies widened the search. They canvassed the immediate area, calling his name into the trees, checking trails he often used. They expected to find tracks, discarded gear, maybe a rifle leaning against a tree. Instead, there was nothing. No footprints in the soft soil, no drag marks, no belongings left behind. The absence of evidence made the situation more unsettling. Back at the lodge, his wife walked through the rooms with investigators. She touched the table where his wallet lay, her hand shaking as if she expected him to walk back in at any moment. The children waited in the car outside, too young to understand why so many officers were searching a place they once considered safe. Theories began immediately. Deputies wondered if he had gone out hunting, slipped, and injured himself. The dense forest was unforgiving, with steep ridges and creeks that could easily trap someone. But if that had happened, why was his truck still there? Why hadn't he taken his gear? Others quietly questioned whether he had chosen to disappear. Men had done so before, leaving behind debts, troubles, or family conflicts. His wife bristled at the suggestion. He wasn't the kind of man who walked away. That night, deputies staged a command post at the lodge. Searchers with flashlights spread through the woods. They called in dogs trained to detect human scent. The hounds pulled toward the creek briefly, then circled aimlessly, unable to hold the trail. Searchers marked the area, returned the next morning, and still found nothing. It was as though the man's presence ended at the walls of the lodge. In the days that followed, word spread through the community. Neighbors stopped by the family home, bringing food, offering prayers. Some whispered their own theories. Maybe he'd been attacked by poachers, maybe he'd gotten lost in the woods, maybe something darker had happened inside the lodge that no one could see. Each rumor added weight to the family's grief. By the end of the first week, there were still no answers. The lodge remained sealed, deputies leaving it as it was in hopes that new evidence might surface. The wife clung to the hope that he was out there somewhere, disoriented or injured, but alive. But each day made that harder to believe. The haunting detail remained: the truck outside, the belongings inside, and the fire still burning when deputies arrived. It suggested he had been there just hours before, close enough to survival that he could still tend the flames. Yet no one could explain where he had gone afterward, or why not a single trace of him could be found. It was the beginning of a mystery that would consume the family, frustrate investigators, and haunt an entire community for more than a decade. And as the lodge sat in silence, one detail everyone overlooked would wait, buried in ash, holding the truth of what really happened that weekend. The morning after deputies discovered the man's belongings inside the lodge, the search began in earnest. Local authorities gathered volunteers from nearby towns, and before long, dozens of people assembled at the edge of the forest, ready to comb the wilderness. For many, it felt like a rescue mission, not yet a recovery. He was an experienced woodsman, familiar with every trail and ridge. The assumption was simple: he had left the lodge for a short walk or a hunting trip and gotten turned around. In late autumn, with temperatures dropping fast, every hour mattered. Teams fanned out from the lodge in tight formations, calling his name into the woods. Radios crackled with updates as deputies marked grids on maps. They searched ridgelines, dry creek beds, and old logging roads. Many believed they would find some trace quickly: a rifle leaning against a tree, a boot print pressed into the soil, or clothing snagged on a branch. But hour after hour passed and there was nothing. The sheriff's office called in cadaver dogs. The animals were unloaded from their trucks, their handlers leading them straight to the lodge. The dogs circled the porch, sniffed along the truck, and then moved toward the tree line. At first, there was hope. The dogs pulled in the same direction, tugging handlers down toward the creek that ran a quarter-mile below the property. Searchers followed, hearts racing. If they were lucky, this would be where the trail ended, where they could finally find him. At the creek bank, the dogs hesitated, sniffing at the ground and pawing at leaves. Handlers marked the location with fluorescent tape, noting the interest. But as they pushed farther along the creek, the animals lost the scent. They circled, whined, and looked back at their handlers, confused. The brief spark of hope faded. Whatever had drawn them to the water left no continuation. There were no footprints, no drag marks, no sign that a man had crossed or fallen in. The trail simply ended. For the family waiting at the lodge, every update felt like whiplash. At one moment, there was talk of a strong scent. The next, nothing. His wife stayed near the cabin, clutching his jacket like an anchor. The children asked if the searchers would bring their father back by nightfall. She couldn't answer them. Searchers pressed on through the next 2 days. Helicopters swept over the forest, using infrared cameras to detect body heat. Deputies coordinated ATV patrols along distant fire breaks. Volunteers walked shoulder to shoulder through thickets so dense that branches tore at their jackets. They found animal tracks, old beer cans, discarded hunting cartridges, but nothing belonging to the missing man. Not a single trace to confirm which way he had gone when he stepped out of the lodge. By the third day, tension set in. Deputies began questioning whether he had ever left the building on foot. If he had wandered, something should have been visible by now. Even the most seasoned hunters who got lost in the woods tended to leave a trail of some kind. The absence of footprints troubled investigators. Soil was soft enough that even small animals left marks, yet there were no human impressions leading away from the cabin. It was as though he had vanished without taking a step. Speculation began to creep into conversations. Some deputies whispered that maybe he had staged his own disappearance. Others wondered about foul play. But those theories raised more questions than answers. His truck was still parked outside. His wallet was inside. His phone had been left on the table with a drained battery. None of it made sense if he had chosen to leave. And there was still no evidence of a struggle, no broken locks, no sign of forced entry, no defensive marks inside the cabin. The search stretched into the weekend. Volunteers thinned as exhaustion and cold set in. Families with flashlights trudged home while deputies worked in shifts. Each night, the lodge grew quieter, filled only with the hum of generators and the low voices of men studying maps. The sheriff called in more dogs, hoping a fresh team might succeed where the first had failed. But the results were the same. Brief interest near the creek. Silence after that. Nothing definitive. When the official search was scaled back after a week, the family was left in limbo. Authorities explained that they had covered more than 20 square miles, checked dozens of possible hazards, and found nothing. Statistically, they said, if he had succumbed to the elements, he would have been discovered. But if he had not, then the possibilities were wider and darker. His wife pleaded for them to continue, her voice cracking in front of reporters. She wasn't ready to believe that he had simply disappeared into the woods. Neighbors began to take sides. Some offered sympathy and support, insisting he must have been taken against his will. Others quietly suggested to each other that maybe he had walked out of his life, that the family would never accept it. His children returned to school carrying the heavy weight of whispers from classmates. Their father's disappearance became a story passed around like gossip, when for them it was an open wound. The lodge remained sealed under a deputy's watch. Investigators cataloged the contents again and again, searching for something they might have missed. Each time the details were the same: his jacket on the hook, his wallet on the table, the fire burned down to ash. Nothing else. The first search ended in silence. No body, no weapon, no clothing, no footprints to guide the family toward answers. Only the chilling sense that the trail had been erased before it began. For the wife and children, it was the start of a long wait, one that would stretch into years. They would cling to each phone call, each rumor, each false lead, hoping one day the silence would break. What none of them knew was that the truth had been there from the beginning, buried in plain sight, inside the very fireplace that had once given them hope he was still alive. When the official search failed to produce any trace, investigators shifted their focus back to the lodge itself. The absence of evidence outside meant they had to scrutinize the details within those walls. The sheriff's report documented every item in the cabin, but it was the small inconsistencies that stood out. His wallet was still there, resting on the table as if he had just emptied his pockets. His watch sat beside it, carefully placed, not dropped. His phone lay lifeless, the battery drained, but his boots were gone. Investigators noted the detail in bold. In rural life, boots were survival. To leave without them was impossible. To disappear with them, but nothing else was stranger still. Friends were interviewed repeatedly. They all said the same thing. He was not the kind of man to take risks. He grew up in these woods, understood the dangers of weather and terrain, and carried himself with a cautious discipline. Recklessness wasn't part of his character. That alone made the disappearance harder to explain. If he had stepped outside in those boots, he would have left a mark. He would have carried gear. He would have followed routine. But nothing matched the pattern of the man they knew. Theories began to form, each more troubling than the last. The first was the most natural to consider: an accident. Maybe he'd gone out for a walk, slipped and been injured. Investigators scoured cliffsides, ravines, and hidden creeks. Yet every inch of likely ground had been searched with no result. Bodies rarely vanished completely, especially in such a short time. If he had fallen, some trace should have been found. The second theory carried a darker tone: suicide. Detectives whispered the word quietly, never to the children, but the thought lingered. Men under stress sometimes chose isolation to end their lives. But if that had been the case, where was the weapon? His rifle remained in the lodge, no rope, no sign of medication, and friends and family alike pushed back, saying he had no history of depression, no debts pressing him, no despair in his voice during that final phone call. Nothing matched the profile of a man preparing to take his own life. The third possibility unsettled the community most: foul play. The lodge, though remote, was not entirely isolated. Old logging roads connected to nearby properties. Hunters, drifters, even opportunists could find their way there. Some wondered if he had encountered someone in the woods who meant him harm. Investigators examined the door and windows for forced entry, but found none. Inside, the cabin was orderly, not ransacked. No valuables were missing, no signs of a fight, no blood. If someone had harmed him, they had done so with precision, leaving nothing behind. Then came the theory no one wanted to believe, but everyone had to consider: a voluntary disappearance. Detectives studied his bank accounts, his work records, his phone history. They found no withdrawals, no suspicious contacts, no signs of planning. His truck, his wallet, his entire life remained untouched. Still, investigators could not dismiss the possibility that he had walked away. Men had abandoned families before, leaving without warning. But to those who knew him, the idea was insulting. His wife bristled when reporters hinted at it. His children clung to the belief that their father would never leave them willingly. To them, it was easier to accept death than abandonment. The sheriff's office found itself caught between options, none of which fully fit the evidence. Each theory opened a door, but every door led to a wall. Deputies grew frustrated. They knew how to handle missing hikers, runaway spouses, even homicides. But this case was a puzzle with missing pieces. As weeks passed, the investigation slowed, but did not stop. Detectives re-interviewed neighbors and co-workers. They looked into rumors of disputes, debts, or affairs. Whispers circulated that he had clashed with a hunting partner over money, or that he had enemies in town. None of it proved credible. Every lead dissolved into speculation. The most haunting part for investigators was the sense of incompleteness. Disappearances usually left a thread, a receipt, a witness sighting, a scrap of clothing, something to tug on. Here, the thread had been cut clean. The man's life seemed to pause at the lodge, leaving nothing beyond. For the family, the uncertainty was unbearable. His wife replayed the final phone call in her head, wondering if she had missed something in his tone, some hidden farewell. His children asked questions she could not answer. Why had he taken his boots but not his wallet? Why would he leave the truck but not come home? Why was there still warmth in the fireplace if he was already gone? At night, she lay awake staring at the ceiling, caught between two fears: that he had died alone in the woods, or that someone had killed him and hidden the truth. Both possibilities left her without peace. She wanted closure, but closure required evidence, and there was none. The investigators' theories circulated endlessly, each one lifted and dropped like a weight. Accident, suicide, foul play, voluntary disappearance. They became words without meaning, spoken so often that they lost clarity. The only certainty was that a man had gone missing in a place where people weren't supposed to vanish. By the end of the first year, the file grew thick with reports, but thin with answers. Detectives admitted to each other that they were stuck. And so the case began its slow drift into cold status, the lodge left behind like a monument to confusion. The family, though, could not let go. They refused to believe he had walked away, not from them, not from the life he had built. They were convinced something else had happened, something no one had yet seen. They didn't know that the answer was waiting in the one place investigators had already looked, documented, and dismissed. The fireplace had been noted in the first report, warm, glowing, ashes piled high, but no one had imagined it as anything more than a source of heat. What seemed ordinary then would one day be revealed as the most disturbing clue of all. In the months after the search was called off, the family tried to hold their lives together, but silence became the constant weight in their home. His wife refused to change anything about the house. His jacket stayed on the hook by the door. His boots, the spare pair he hadn't taken to the lodge, remained under the bench in the hallway. The bed on his side was left untouched, and the nightstand still held his reading glasses and half-finished book. To her, these details weren't clutter. They were proof that he belonged, that he was supposed to return. The children struggled most with the absence. At school, their father's disappearance turned into gossip, carried from classroom whispers to lunch tables. Some classmates pitied them. Others mocked them, saying their father had abandoned the family and run off. The older child clenched fists at the mention, once getting into a fight that left teachers calling home. The younger one cried in private, too afraid to tell classmates that each night he still expected to hear his father's truck in the driveway. As the weeks turned into months, rumors began to ripple through the community. Small towns rarely keep secrets for long, and a case with no answers left room for speculation. Some claimed he had been drowning in debt, though bank records showed otherwise. Others suggested he was unfaithful, inventing stories of a woman in another town. A few even hinted at darker things, that he had enemies, that he might have crossed someone he shouldn't have. His wife rejected all of it, but the rumors spread like smoke, clouding how neighbors looked at the family. The sheriff's office, having little progress to show, quietly distanced themselves. Deputies admitted off record that they had no evidence of foul play. Without a body, without a crime scene, they couldn't move the case forward. That left the family in a torturous limbo, grieving without confirmation, waiting without direction. Each anniversary of his disappearance was marked not by closure, but by the reopening of old wounds. Local papers wrote brief updates, reminding the town that no answers had been found. Each article sparked another round of speculation. Inside the house, tension grew. His wife wanted to keep his memory alive, convinced that answers would eventually come. She kept a box of notes, phone numbers of detectives, and clippings from newspapers. She called the sheriff's office monthly, asking if anything new had surfaced. She told her children never to let go of hope, but hope came with a cost. Bills piled up, birthdays passed without him. The weight of living in a museum of his absence wore down everyone in the home. Family members on the outside began to disagree. His brother insisted they should hold a memorial, declare him legally dead, and move on. His parents quietly sided with him, believing it might be the only way for the children to heal. But his wife refused. To her, a memorial was giving up, a betrayal of the man she still believed had not abandoned them. Arguments fractured family gatherings. Holidays turned tense, with half the family demanding closure and the other half clinging to hope. The children were caught in the middle. The older one began pulling away, frustrated with the endless waiting. He told friends he believed his father was dead, though he never admitted it at home. The younger child, still clutching to innocence, believed every rumor that his father might be out there. Each time the phone rang, he looked to see if it could be him. Each time a car slowed near the driveway, he thought it was a sign. The conflicting beliefs within the household became another source of pain. A year passed, and the house remained frozen in time. His toothbrush still sat in the bathroom. His hunting license remained pinned to the corkboard in the kitchen. For his wife, keeping these items was a shield against rumors, a way to prove that he was still part of their lives. But to outsiders, it was seen differently. Neighbors began to whisper that she couldn't let go, that she was living in denial, maybe even hiding something. Each sideways glance at the grocery store reminded her how quickly sympathy could turn into suspicion. Police occasionally revisited the case, but their updates never brought relief. A hunter in another county claimed he had seen a man matching the description at a gas station. Detectives checked. Nothing. Another lead suggested someone was living off-grid in the mountains, using a false name. Again, no connection. Each false lead raised hopes only to crush them again. The emotional roller coaster left the family exhausted. As the second year approached, the children changed in visible ways. The older child grew guarded, suspicious of anyone who asked about the case. The younger one grew quiet, retreating into drawings and notebooks filled with imagined reunions. Their mother tried to keep them steady, but she carried her own exhaustion. She often sat at the kitchen table after midnight, staring at his empty chair, wondering which was worse, that he had died violently or that he had chosen to leave them. The community's perception shifted again when rumors of secrets took hold. Some said he'd been involved in something criminal, that his disappearance was the consequence of debts unpaid. Others whispered that the marriage had been falling apart, that maybe his wife knew more than she admitted. None of these stories were supported by fact, but in the absence of truth, they spread like wildfire. The family carried the weight of suspicion along with grief. Through it all, the lodge remained untouched, locked by the sheriff's department, its contents gathering dust. The family drove by only once in that first year, too painful to return. They couldn't know then that the place they avoided held the very evidence they needed. The ashes in that fireplace, dismissed as nothing more than remnants of a final fire, carried the truth that would not emerge for more than a decade. As the years went on, the investigation shifted from active search to following tips that trickled in sporadically. Each time a call came through to the sheriff's office, the family felt the same uneasy pull of hope, wondering if this would finally be the one that broke the silence. Early on, a truck driver phoned in from 2 states away, claiming he had seen a man who looked remarkably similar at a highway truck stop. He described him as tired, unshaven, wearing a ball cap pulled low. Deputies coordinated with law enforcement in that state, who pulled security footage from the truck stop's cameras. The grainy images showed a man of similar build, but when slowed down and analyzed, the details didn't hold. The nose was slightly different, the jawline less sharp. The man bought coffee, filled his tank, and drove away. The lead, which at first had given the family a surge of cautious optimism, dissolved into nothing more than coincidence. Months later, another tip surfaced. A caller insisted he was living off-grid with a group of survivalists deep in the mountains. The caller claimed the missing man had grown a beard and taken on a new name. Detectives dug into the story, contacting rangers who patrolled the remote area. They found the survivalist camp, but no sign of the missing father. The men there laughed at the suggestion, insisting no one like him had ever joined them. Once again, hope collapsed under the weight of reality. These kinds of false starts became a pattern. Some swore they had seen him in diners, others claimed he had been working under the table at construction sites. Detectives chased each rumor, burning hours, collecting statements, pulling surveillance footage. Each time, the evidence fell apart. Sometimes it was simply mistaken identity. Other times it was fabrication, people craving attention or inserting themselves into a case that had grown to mythic status in the community. The family, worn down by disappointment, began to dread new leads almost as much as they longed for them. Each one reignited old wounds. His wife kept a notebook, writing down dates, names, and places, crossing them out in red pen when they were disproven. The pages became a record of failure, each line a reminder of how many times she had been forced to relive the first day of his disappearance. Detectives knew the case was slipping from priority. Larger crimes demanded their attention, new emergencies pushed old files aside. The missing person case with no evidence, no body, no activity on bank accounts or phone records was hard to justify keeping at the forefront. The sheriff admitted quietly to the family that unless something new surfaced, the case was destined for cold storage. He promised not to close it, but the message was clear. Without fresh evidence, there would be no resolution. The lodge itself remained locked. For years, deputies returned occasionally to review the scene, walking through the same rooms, photographing the same details. Each time, nothing new emerged. The wallet on the table, the rifle leaning against the wall, the bed unmade, and the fireplace filled with layers of hardened ash, logged in reports but never considered significant. To the investigators, it was ordinary, evidence of a man keeping warm during his last known hours. It was catalogued and dismissed. By the 5th year, the family noticed how rarely detectives called with updates. They began reaching out themselves, leaving messages that were returned less and less often. His wife sat in waiting rooms of sheriff's offices, asking to speak to anyone still assigned to the file. Each meeting ended the same way, with sympathetic nods, vague assurances, and the quiet suggestion that sometimes people disappear without answers. The children, now older, processed the silence in different ways. The older one distanced himself, weary of the endless cycle of false hope. He refused to answer when classmates asked about the case, telling them it was over, even though it wasn't. The younger one clung to stories, researching survivalists and lost hikers, convinced his father was still out there, choosing to live beyond society. For him, believing his father was alive, even as a ghost on the edges of the world, was less painful than believing he was gone. Through the years, the family house grew quieter. The photographs stayed on the walls, but dust collected around them. Birthdays passed with candles lit for someone who never returned. His wife aged in ways that weren't just physical. Her eyes grew heavier, her posture slumped under the weight of carrying a mystery no one else seemed intent on solving. By the 12th year, the case file sat in a cabinet of cold cases, its pages yellowed and edges frayed. The lodge was visited only by weather and time, its silence unbroken except for the occasional animal wandering through the clearing. Investigators had moved on, but the family had not. To them, the absence was louder than ever because it was permanent. The trail had gone cold, and there was no new heat to revive it. What no one realized was that the very evidence detectives had cataloged and forgotten, the fireplace ash, hardened and overlooked, was not ordinary at all. It contained the key to everything. The disturbing truth sat there year after year, waiting for someone to finally look closely enough to see what it really held. 12 years had passed since the father vanished, and the lodge that once held so many unanswered questions had been left to rot in silence. The family rarely spoke of it anymore, at least not out loud, but it lingered in every unspoken moment between them. His wife had grown older, carrying the weight of absence, and the children had grown into adults with lives of their own. Yet when the subject of the lodge finally returned, it stirred everything they had tried to bury. The property was still in their name, still costing money, still sitting there like a frozen reminder of the day everything changed. The decision to sell wasn't easy, but it was practical. The children returned to the clearing with a realtor and a locksmith, unsure what they would find inside. The last time they had stood at the threshold, they were children, clutching each other while deputies combed the woods. Now they approached with heavy steps, unlocking a door that had been shut for more than a decade. The hinges groaned open, releasing stale air that smelled of dust and wood long left untouched. Inside, it was as if time had stopped. The same wallet still sat on the table, its leather cracked and faded. His watch was there too, the glass face clouded from years of neglect. Dishes sat in the sink with a thin film of grime hardened over them. The bed in the corner still bore the impression of his last night's rest. Cobwebs draped across the ceiling, dust lay thick on the furniture, but beneath it all, the scene remained eerily familiar. It looked almost exactly as the sheriff's report had described 12 years earlier. The children walked slowly, each object tugging memories back into focus. For the older one, the wallet was a reminder of how impossible it was to believe their father had walked away. For the younger, the bed was proof that he had been there, alive right before he disappeared. Every item reignited questions that had never been answered, but it was the fireplace that drew their eyes the longest. The hearth was clogged with a mound of hardened ash, solidified after years of neglect. Unlike the dust that coated the rest of the room, the fireplace felt deliberate, as though it had been sealed in place. They remembered how deputies had once noted it in their reports, describing it as warm to the touch on the day their father went missing. At the time, it seemed meaningless, but standing before it now, the children felt unease they couldn't ignore. It had remained undisturbed all these years, a frozen monument to the last fire their father ever built. Before they could move forward with selling the property, they were told by the realtor that demolition or restoration would require clearance from local authorities. It was standard practice for any property tied to an open case. The siblings didn't argue. Deep down, they wanted professionals to look at it again. They wanted someone to walk through these rooms with fresh eyes, to make sure nothing had been overlooked. Even after 12 years, they still needed answers. So they made the call. The sheriff's office, under new leadership by then, received the request. On paper, it was routine. Confirm there were no hazards, confirm there was nothing left of evidentiary value. But to the cold case unit that now oversaw files like this one, it was an opportunity. With modern forensic tools unavailable in the original investigation, there was a chance to re-examine the lodge in ways that hadn't been possible before. The siblings waited outside as deputies entered with evidence kits and protective gloves. They heard the officers' muted voices as they walked the rooms, describing details into handheld recorders. The items on the table were bagged again, not because they expected new revelations, but because procedure demanded it. The bed was photographed once more, the sink, the duffel bag, all the same. But when the deputies reached the fireplace, they paused. The mound of ash was no longer loose and powdery. It had hardened over the years, forming a compact layer that looked almost like cement. One deputy tapped it with a gloved hand, remarking quietly that it didn't feel like ordinary soot. It was dense, resistant, as if it had fused with something beneath. They noted it in their log and prepared to collect a sample. For the children standing outside, it was agonizing to wait. Every moment inside the lodge felt like reopening an old wound. They didn't want to relive the pain, but they also couldn't turn away. If something had been missed all those years ago, they needed to know. The fireplace ash was scraped carefully, chunk by chunk, into evidence bags. The deputies treated it with the same seriousness they would at a crime scene. The siblings were told not to expect anything, that it was most likely harmless residue from wood burned years ago. But even the tone of the deputies' voices betrayed curiosity. There was something unusual about how solid the ash had become. The lodge was sealed again that night, pending results from the forensic lab. The children drove away with heavy silence between them, both thinking the same thing but not daring to say it out loud. That maybe, after all these years, the truth had been sitting in that fireplace, waiting to be uncovered. When the request came in from the family to clear the lodge for sale, the sheriff's department treated it as routine. But when the case file crossed the desk of the county's cold case unit, it struck a chord. By then, 12 years had passed, and the tools at their disposal had changed dramatically. What once relied on handwritten notes and simple observation could now be revisited with advanced forensic methods. The lodge, long abandoned, offered a rare opportunity to step back into a scene that time had preserved. Detectives entered the cabin with fresh eyes, their equipment heavier and more precise than the deputies who had walked these rooms over a decade earlier. They started as before, with photographs and notes, retracing the steps of those who had documented the lodge in the first days of the disappearance. The wallet, the watch, the bed, all frozen in their positions. But it was the fireplace that drew the most attention. What had once been dismissed as nothing more than the remnants of a fire now looked unusual. The ash was dense, compact, layered, like something that had been burned not once, but repeatedly. Technicians donned gloves and laid out tarps. Instead of brushing the ash aside, they began to extract it piece by piece, carefully scraping hardened sections into evidence containers. The material resisted, breaking apart in thick chunks rather than powder. Beneath the top layer, a faint metallic glint caught one detective's eye. At first, it was dismissed as a nail or a remnant from firewood, but as more fragments emerged, the pattern shifted. These weren't ordinary scraps. They were small, rounded pieces of metal with edges blackened by heat. The team slowed down further, using sieves to separate fine ash from anything solid. With every sift, new fragments appeared, tiny metallic shapes that seemed out of place in a simple fireplace. One technician lifted a piece with tweezers, holding it to the light. It looked like the remains of dental filling material, melted and distorted by extreme heat. A chill ran through the team. This was no longer a forgotten hearth. As the layers continued to give way, something even more unsettling surfaced. Amid the clumps of ash were irregular fragments with a porous texture, brittle yet distinct. They resembled bone, but charred beyond recognition. Each was bagged and labeled, the detectives speaking in hushed voices now, fully aware of what they were uncovering. The silence of the lodge shifted from neglect to suspicion. A building once considered a place of absence now stood as a crime scene. The atmosphere in the room grew heavy. Detectives who had once thought of the case as little more than a tragic disappearance now faced the possibility that the missing man had never left the lodge at all. The idea that his remains had been here, hidden in plain sight, for 12 years was almost unbearable to process. Outside, the siblings waited in their car, watching officers carry sealed evidence bags to their vehicles. They asked no questions, but their stomachs turned as they realized the fireplace was being emptied into containers. They had lived half their lives not knowing if their father was alive or dead, and now it seemed the truth had been sitting beneath ash they once thought of as harmless. Back inside, the work continued late into the evening. Investigators documented every detail: the depth of the ash layers, the size of the fragments, the exact location of each discovery. Samples were packed for DNA testing, others for metallurgical analysis. The lodge, which had stood untouched for over a decade, now hummed with the energy of a fresh investigation. When the last of the ash had been removed, the hearth was nearly bare. What remained was not just soot, but the fragments of a hidden story. Detectives sealed the cabin once again, but this time it wasn't as a formality. Now it was evidence, part of an active investigation into what could only be considered a deliberate attempt to conceal human remains. For the cold case unit, the ETO discovery reopened every question. Who had burned him? Why had no one noticed the smell, the smoke, or the evidence at the time? How could an entire search effort have scoured miles of wilderness while the truth lay smoldering in a fireplace? That night, the siblings received the call from the lead detective. The details were sparse. Fragments had been recovered, testing would take time, but the message was clear. Their father hadn't vanished into thin air. He had been there all along, inside the lodge they had feared and avoided for years. The family's relief was poisoned by horror. The mystery of whether he had left them was finally answered, but it was replaced by a darker truth. Someone had gone to great lengths to ensure he would never be found. The fireplace, once dismissed as an ordinary detail, now stood as the most important piece of evidence in the entire case. And with its contents on their way to the lab, the lodge that had once been silent now screamed with questions no one was prepared to answer. The evidence collected from the lodge fireplace was rushed to the state forensic lab, packaged in carefully sealed containers. For detectives, the fragments represented the first tangible lead in a case that had been cold for over a decade. They had learned not to expect miracles in work like this, but as analysts began their examination, the pieces told a story too disturbing to ignore. Under magnification, the fragments that looked like brittle stone revealed something more complex. They were porous in structure, curved in ways that matched no wood or ordinary debris. One section bore a density consistent with cortical bone, the type found in human skeletal remains. Analysts compared them to reference samples, and the similarities were undeniable. These weren't scraps of burned timber. They were human. The metallic fragments told an equally grim tale. What investigators had first thought might be melted nails or hardware were identified as dental filling material, partially intact despite extreme heat. One fragment showed the distinct curvature of a molar fused with silver amalgam. Another contained resin used in modern dentistry. Piece by piece, the lab confirmed what the family had long dreaded but never considered possible: that the father had not walked away from the lodge at all. He had been reduced to ash in the very fireplace that investigators once brushed aside. But the revelations didn't stop there. Chemical analysis of the ash revealed traces of accelerants, compounds that had no place in ordinary firewood. Gasoline residues, faint but measurable, were embedded in the hardened material. The burn had been hotter and more deliberate than any household fire. It wasn't a case of someone accidentally falling into the flames or a tragic mishap. This was controlled, purposeful, designed to destroy evidence. Detectives gathered in silence as the results were presented. For 12 years, the disappearance had been a mystery. Now it was something else entirely, a homicide concealed with precision. The realization reframed everything about the investigation. All the theories of voluntary disappearance, of a man lost in the woods or choosing to abandon his family, collapsed in an instant. He hadn't left them. He had never left the lodge. When the family received the news, the shock was layered with grief and fury. His wife, who had spent years enduring whispers that he had run away, broke down when detectives told her his remains had been there the entire time. The children, now adults, processed the revelation with a mix of relief and horror. Relief, because the haunting uncertainty of whether he had abandoned them was gone. Horror, because the truth was far worse. Someone had burned him inside the lodge, and no one had noticed. The community, too, was stunned. For years, rumors had painted him as a man who might have fled, a man with secrets. The discovery of his remains shifted suspicion outward. If he hadn't left voluntarily, someone else had been involved, and if someone had killed him, that meant a murderer had walked free all this time, undetected, possibly still living among them. The sheriff's office reopened the file with urgency. Detectives pored over every page of the original reports, now seeing them with fresh eyes. Why had the fireplace not been tested more thoroughly the first time? Why had the warm ash been dismissed as irrelevant? The oversight was painful, but it was also undeniable. The evidence had been there from the beginning, waiting to be found. The lab continued to identify fragments. Among them was a portion of jawbone, still intact enough to reveal dental patterns. Comparing them with the father's dental records, the match was confirmed. There was no doubt anymore. The man who had vanished from the lodge 12 years earlier had never made it beyond its walls. His life had ended there, consumed in fire. Detectives now faced new questions. Who had access to the lodge that weekend? Who had the opportunity to burn him, destroy the evidence, and lock the place back up as though nothing had happened? Old names resurfaced. Neighbors, hunting partners, even family members who had been considered but never thoroughly investigated. The case was no longer about finding a missing man. It was about finding a killer who had managed to hide the truth in plain sight. For the family, the revelation was both closure and a deeper wound. They no longer had to wonder if he had chosen to leave them, but they were forced to confront a darker reality, that his life had been stolen and that someone had gone to extraordinary lengths to erase him. Their grief, already stretched over 12 years, sharpened into anger. They wanted justice, but after so much time, they feared it might be out of reach. The lodge, once thought of as a monument to confusion, was now a crime scene. Deputies placed fresh tape around its perimeter, treating it, not as an abandoned property, but as the site of a homicide. Detectives ordered new forensic sweeps, testing the floorboards, the walls, and the chimney for any additional traces. The work that had been overlooked 12 years earlier was now painstakingly redone. What they had uncovered was horrifying, but it was only the beginning. The realization that the missing father had been hidden in the fireplace ash all along opened the door to new possibilities. Someone had committed murder. Someone had lived 12 years knowing the truth, and now, for the first time, detectives had evidence that could turn suspicion into answers. With the confirmation that the fireplace ash contained human remains, detectives no longer viewed the case as a mystery of disappearance, but as an unsolved homicide. The question was no longer where the man had gone, but who had wanted him gone badly enough to burn him inside his own lodge. The cold case unit reopened every file, pulling out statements that had been boxed up for more than a decade. Each page carried names, timelines, and alibis that now had to be reconsidered. The first name that surfaced was an old hunting partner. Back when the man was alive, the two had spent countless weekends together, but their relationship had fractured over money. Court records showed they had once invested in a small piece of land together, a deal that ended in dispute. Friends remembered heated arguments, accusations of betrayal, and debts left unresolved. At the time of the disappearance, investigators had interviewed the partner, who claimed he hadn't seen him in weeks. His alibi placed him hours away, working on a construction site. Without evidence to dispute it, deputies had let it go. Now, with the discovery in the fireplace, detectives returned to his door. He denied any involvement, repeating the same alibi, insisting the financial dispute had been exaggerated by rumor. But detectives noted his defensiveness and the fact that a motive, however old, still lingered. The second name was even closer to home. A brother-in-law had long been whispered about in family circles, mostly in connection to inheritance. Property tied to the family stood to pass down if the missing man was declared legally dead. For years, suspicion flickered around him, though no evidence had ever supported it. In interviews, he had maintained that he was at home the weekend of the disappearance, working on his own property. He had seemed almost indifferent, describing the missing man as unreliable, a characterization that had stung the wife deeply. Detectives revisited him now, asking direct questions about his whereabouts 12 years earlier, about access to the lodge, about why his tone had been so detached. He bristled at the insinuations, denying involvement, insisting he had nothing to gain and no reason to kill. Yet detectives couldn't ignore the timing. A property dispute combined with opportunity made him impossible to dismiss. Outright, the third name belonged to a neighbor, a man who lived down one of the logging roads that fed into the forest. Back then, he had been seen near the lodge on multiple occasions, often uninvited. He knew the land well, had easy access, and was known to slip onto properties without permission. In the first investigation, deputies had questioned him, but his answers were vague. He admitted to occasionally using the trails, but denied ever entering the lodge. Neighbors described him as quiet but unpredictable. When detectives spoke to him again after the forensic revelations, he acted startled, repeating that he had never gone near the lodge that weekend. His denial was strong, but the access he had, combined with his odd behavior in the past, made him a figure of interest once more. As detectives traced these leads, they ran into the crushing reality of time. 12 years had stripped away the freshness of memory. Alibis that once seemed strong were harder to verify. People had moved, phone records were long gone, and surveillance footage from those days no longer existed. The kind of evidence that could have made or broken a case in the first weeks was now dust. What remained were old interviews, imperfect recollections, and a few fragments of motive. For the family, watching the suspects resurface was painful. They had lived alongside some of these men for years, attending the same gatherings, walking past them at stores, never knowing if one of them had hidden the truth. The possibility that a family member or a trusted friend might have been responsible deepened the betrayal. His wife, who had endured suspicion herself when others whispered he had left voluntarily, now wondered if the real answer had been much closer all along. Detectives pushed hard, re-interviewing witnesses, hoping someone might crack under the weight of new evidence. They asked about gasoline purchases, about odd behavior after the disappearance, about who had keys to the lodge. Each suspect denied everything, standing firm despite the questions. Without confessions or new physical evidence, the trail grew thin. It was one thing to confirm a murder had taken place. It was another to tie it to a single hand. The case files thickened with new notes, but progress felt illusory. Leads fizzled out, just as they had all those years ago. Detectives admitted privately that while they had finally proven the man was murdered, they might never prove by whom. The ash had revealed a disturbing truth, but not enough to name a killer. For the family, the grief doubled back on itself. They finally knew he hadn't abandoned them, but they were left with an even darker question. Who had taken him from them, and how had that person managed to live free for more than a decade? The absence of justice cut almost as deep as the absence of the man himself. As the investigation slowed once more, the lodge stood silent under the weight of its new label, crime scene. It had taken 12 years for the truth to surface, and even now, the truth remained partial. Detectives could confirm what had happened, but not who had done it. And with every suspect denying involvement, the trail that began in fire threatened to die out in silence once again. When the forensic results came back, the weight of 12 years of silence finally cracked. The family, who had lived under the suspicion that their father had walked away, now had confirmation he had never left them. The remains in the fireplace were his. The jawbone fragments and dental fillings erased every theory of abandonment or voluntary disappearance. He hadn't chosen to go. He had been murdered, and someone had taken deliberate steps to erase him. For his wife, the revelation was both vindication and devastation. She had fought against the whispers that he had run off, had kept his belongings untouched in the house as proof that he would never willingly abandon his family. Now she was proven right, but the cost of being right was unbearable. The thought that he had died alone, not in an accident, not lost in the woods, but at the hands of another person, gnawed at her more deeply than the mystery ever had. The children, now adults, felt the impact in different ways. The older one, who had spent years trying to move on, felt a surge of anger at the system that had missed the truth for so long. The fireplace had been cataloged in the first days of the investigation. It had been noted as warm, the ashes photographed, but no one had looked deeper. To him, it felt like a second betrayal, that the answers had been there all along and that their family had been forced to endure years of doubt because of an oversight. The younger sibling, who had always held on to the idea that their father might still be alive, was crushed. The hope he had carried quietly for over a decade was extinguished, leaving nothing but grief and rage. Detectives tried to manage expectations. They explained to the family that while the remains proved homicide, the chances of a conviction were slim. Time had stripped away witnesses, erased physical evidence, and blurred memories. The fragments from the fireplace could confirm death, but they could not point to a killer. Motives remained speculative. Disputes over money, inheritance conflicts, grudges left unspoken. But without more evidence, none could be proven. Every potential suspect denied involvement, and no one cracked under questioning. For the community, the revelation sent shockwaves. The missing man, who had once been rumored to have run away or chosen a new life, had in fact been killed in the most brutal way imaginable. The rumors that had circulated for years collapsed in the face of fact. Yet the exposure of truth only deepened unease. It meant that for 12 years, someone who had committed murder had walked free. Someone had shared streets, stores, and conversations with neighbors while holding a secret that had destroyed an entire family. The lodge, once just a remote cabin in the woods, became the focus of media attention. News crews reported on the discovery, showing the yellow tape around the property, calling it a house of unanswered questions. Commentators criticized the original investigation, asking how the most important clue could have been overlooked. For the family, each headline cut deep. They had wanted the truth, but now the truth was out in the open, reshaping the story of their father's life into something darker than they could have imagined. The case was officially listed as an unsolved homicide, reopened but stagnant. Detectives promised to pursue every angle, but even they admitted privately that without new evidence or a confession, the odds were slim. The family was left in limbo once again, this time not with the torment of not knowing, but with the torment of knowing too much and not enough at the same time. They had confirmation of death, confirmation of murder, but no justice. The killer remained a shadow, name unknown, motive unproven. The disturbing truth was that their father had never vanished into the wilderness, never chosen to leave. He had been taken from them, his body destroyed in fire, his memory clouded by rumor for over a decade. The family was right to believe he hadn't abandoned them, but the confirmation brought no comfort. It only opened deeper wounds. They had answers, but no closure. In the end, the fireplace told the story no one had wanted to hear. For 12 years, the ashes had sat undisturbed, holding fragments of a man's life, fragments that spoke louder than any theory or rumor. When they were finally sifted, they revealed the reality, that a father's life had ended not with a disappearance, but with violence, concealed in plain sight. The case remains open, a file marked by more questions than conclusions. The family visits the lodge only in memory now, unable to bear the thought of what it had contained. They live with the knowledge that the truth had been there from the beginning, waiting to be uncovered, but too late to deliver justice. The mystery that haunted them for 12 years ended not with relief, but with horror. He hadn't walked away, he hadn't gotten lost, he hadn't chosen another life. He had been murdered and burned within the lodge fireplace. The truth answered one question, but left another lingering, heavier than ever. Who destroyed him, and why?